Tariq is here. Wow, what an honor. I was not Tariq. How's it going, man? What's going on?
Hey, brother, how are you?
How are you, man? It's an honor to have you. I've uh,
Absolutely.
I've been a fan for a long time. I've been kind of watching your content, and I think it's great stuff. Very interesting.
Yes, sir. Interesting conversation. Very interesting conversation. So just to be clear, so are you saying the answer to a lot of systematic racism would be communism? Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah, but I don't mean it in the sense of one broad brush. I mean it in the sense of a very specific and unified way in which America's particular problems are addressed and recognized.
Hmm. Okay. And you think communism would be the answer?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now,
Basically,
in your view, how would that work in your view?
well, basically, communism historically it was always about raising the property question. And
Okay.
what needs to be built is a movement which recognizes that there's no such thing as being an American citizen who has a stake in this country and its future. For example, if you don't have land or if you don't have a home, if you don't have some kind of form of security that lets you stand on 2 feet without being dependent, on banks being in debt or something else. And we only recognize that we're Americans on paper. Okay, we're citizens and we can vote and we have rights, but in practice, that doesn't mean we're actually all Americans in the same way. If you have land and you have a home, that's the foundation of opportunity. It's the
Right.
foundation of building wealth. It's the foundation of communities, and communities are all successful communities and families. They share their wealth. They share their capital. They make sure that everybody's gonna make it. And for a lot of the richest families in America, that's what they do. And all I'm saying is, even to have an ability to compete, you need that foundation. You need some kind of security to fall back on, and that's really what we don't have.
Right, but yeah, under the system of white supremacy, they wouldn't allow that type of communism because there's communist countries that still practice white supremacy. You look at Cuba. Cuba is a communist society, but the black people there are still marginalized. They're still living in the poorest areas. They still get the poorest jobs and the lowest wages. So they're not treated equally in a so called communist system. White supremacy can still trump that. Even in Russia, they're known for having African students come over and they harshly mistreat the African students. So in practice, it's not the same as in theory, just like in the United States. In theory, this is a melting pot and all men are created equal. But in practice, white supremacy is the law of the land. And I saw you mention Karl Marx. He had um, theoretic views, but in practice, he himself was an anti-black racist. Karl Marx would write letters to some of his colleagues denigrating black people. So white supremacy is generally the common law of the land. People will say one thing on paper and put one theory out, but they will practice something else. And unfortunately, people choose to practice white supremacy, anti-black racism over any other theory that they put out, and that has been the problem. The problem is that they have military backing over the common law practice of white supremacy, no matter what system we're under: communism, capitalism, socialism, Marxism. All of those end up getting trumped by systematic white supremacy. So, what do we do to replace the system of white supremacy so that we could practice some of these other systems? These other systems theoretically would be great if we had the problem of white supremacy out of the mix. How do we fix that?
Yeah, yeah. I wanna basically address that last part concretely because I think that's the most important one. But I just want to say real quick, I can't speak too much on Cuba because I don't really know much about the situation there, so I'm not going to speak on it. But I know that, for example, in Russia, I don't think there's a unique. I don't think it's a problem if foreigners are being mistreated. It's because they're black. I think it's more that you know Russians. They have a culture. They already have a multi-ethnic, different cultures from Central Asia and all this. And historically, Russia was a big supporter of the Black Freedom Movement in the U.S. And they brought over Paul Robeson, and I went to the Kremlin, and there was black communist leaders that were buried at the Kremlin. And so I don't think Russia is a white supremacist country, but I think the root of white supremacy, basically, just to get to the bottom of what you're talking about, I would say it's geopolitical. White supremacy is based in the concrete financial dominance, very specifically, of the City of London and Wall Street. But historically, that was based on capital that was accumulated by colonial Europe. And the very purport of a United States of America that's separate from Europe was only something that was ever able to be realized because of the Black freedom struggle. It otherwise, when we're talking about white supremacy, that's just Europe. That was a form of dependency and reliance upon Europe, which I think the American dream has always been to free ourselves from. So I see the struggle for American communism as united, specifically not just against white supremacy, but more, concretely, it's about having it so we become Americans, not not Europe, not a colony of Europe, or a subsidiary of European civilization, but a totally unique and new civilization, which is not just white.
But well, to say that white supremacy was just a European thing, that would historically not quite be correct because they were practicing white supremacy by name here. You had people like Andrew Jackson who talked about white supremacy. You had Abraham Lincoln who talked about if he's going to assign supremacy, he's going to assign it to the white race. You had Thomas Jefferson who wrote extensively on white supremacy and anti black inferiority in his book, The Letters of the State of Virginia. He spoke explicitly about the importance of white supremacy. People call him the father of modern white supremacy, in fact. Um, so many of the writers and so-called forefathers, they were very explicit about building a nation of white supremacy. That's what the Confederates were really doing. That was their whole platform, creating a society based on white supremacy. So this is their word. Even in the Dred Scott decision, Judge Taney talks about how black people don't have rights that the white man is bound to respect, and they went on about white supremacy, black inferiority. So white supremacy was something that was deeply ingrained in the culture here. So it became a global phenomenon. Everywhere the Europeans went, they took white supremacy with them. The Spanish, the French, the English, all of them took white supremacy and they said it by name. So it is a global thing. So we just can't regulate it to one part of Europe. This was a global thing and it's a global problem now. So, how do we replace the system of global white supremacy with a system of justice?
I mean, yeah, you're totally right. Of course, white supremacy was here from the beginning in America, throughout all of American history. It's
Right.
definitely not something that was just confined to Europe. But my argument is just that from the perspective of the ideal of a unique and unified, the ideal, just the ideal,
Mhm.
and I got to emphasize that the white supremacy of the people you mentioned, the American, the Abraham Lincoln, and that was a relic of Europe. That was them being unable to shed off those relics of the past and go all in on America, and all in on this country separately. And that's why I said it's the black freedom struggle, which was really which was really about putting America first before there was any kind of America first. It was about realizing the ideal and living up to the ideal that was at the foundation, but again, we have always had the baggage of Europe weighing on us, not just in terms of the ideology and the mentality of white supremacy, but even financially and economically. Even the financial dependency on European creditors, we never fully freed ourselves from it. I mean, and you mentioned the Confederacy. It's very true, um, that they were trying to create explicitly a white supremacist state and have that enshrined in their, not just in common law but overt law. But
Hmm.
we should also keep in mind, because a lot of people don't know this, is that during the Civil War, it was Britain and France that funded the Confederacy and were helping them out, and that was Lincoln and the North. They had their own reasons, of course, but the Confederacy were also, in addition to serving the slaveholders' interest, they were fulfilling the European agenda here as well. Because they wanted to, they thought it would be a way to take the colonies back.
Right. Hmm. Hmm. That's true. And what's another interesting thing about the Civil War is that the South was winning at first. They were really beating the North pretty badly, and the North started to recruit black Maroons. The Underground Railroad was a place in the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina and Virginia. That was a sanctuary city for black people who were runaways. The white people were not allowed in that area. That's one of the few areas that was white supremacist free, and it never got infiltrated or sacked or conquered. And that was a place where they ended up getting troops to fight in the Civil War, and that's how they won the Civil War. And even Abraham Lincoln said they would have not won the Civil War if it were not for the black freedmen. So there's a lot of interesting stories about the Civil War that a lot of people don't know about.
I mean, I didn't know that, but that's really interesting, and I think there's a poetic justice to it. Thinking about it, because here you have the Confederates, relying on European money to continue going, and then
Hmm.
here's the North who were relying on the indigenous black, soldiers to win that war, and it's really puts into perspective. It's about America, versus basically, forces that want to totally destroy it, and I think yeah, I was never taught about the role of the marooners and the black soldiers you just mentioned,
Right.
and I find it very interesting, how decisive that was. And that was something that was coming from the soil and the roots of this country. That wasn't coming from a foreign power making that happen. So, I think that's the real America, basically.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, but and here's another thing that's kind of ironic. Even though it was black people who helped the North win the Civil War, after the Civil War, some of the Union soldiers went down into Natchez, Mississippi, and they created a slight genocide against some of the newly freed enslaved foundational Black Americans. They had something called the Devil's Punch Bowl, where they sat there and locked the people down and starved them out, and many of them died. So the Union soldiers did a real dirty payback game to the foundational Black Americans who were freed afterwards. So we've always had this relationship where we would fight for the country and try to preserve the integrity of the country. And after the war, we get even more marginalized. Even after World War II, even my family members went over to Germany and helped free people and help the United States win. Yet when they got back here, they couldn't get the same benefits that white soldiers would get. We couldn't get a GI Bill. We couldn't get the same home loans. We couldn't get the same resources. So we got marginalized over here after the World War II and other wars like that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and so here's where I'm coming from with the communism thing. Basically, is and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this. I think that a lot of this the what you call the common law white supremacy, where they're excluding especially the black people who gave their lives for this country to build and make it what it is. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we never had an economic bill of rights that is for all Americans. And so they could very selectively only apply the economic benefits to whoever they wanted because technically it was a privilege, not a right, you know? And to me, it's not that I think that, communism should just be totally colorblind, but I think it's something that can acknowledge the different races or peoples that make up, historically America's. Because I don't know if you agree. I think that there's only three major groups that are the main groups that are part of American history. One is the foundational Black Americans. The others would be Hispanics, like from Mexico primarily, and then the European Americans. The rest don't really have a strong footing in the country. And I feel like communism can be a very specific way to address and recognize that reality explicitly. So it's not a matter of common law anymore. Um, it's a matter of economic rights for Americans,
Well,
similar to Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign.
well, the thing is, it sounds good on paper, but whenever black people, whenever we start getting a financial stronghold anywhere, unfortunately, the white supremacists, they just come along and destroy it. And this has been the problem historically. We talk about the Greenwood area of Tulsa, and the people are still, some of them are still alive, and they're not receiving justice now. They just had their case struck down in court a few weeks ago, and some of the survivors, they're like 110, 100, I mean, like 105, 104 years old. So they're still around, and they're still not receiving justice after the city dropped bombs on their prosperous community. You have other places like Rosewood, Florida, which was a prominent black area, destroyed by white supremacists in 1923. Wilmington, North Carolina, prosperous black area, got destroyed by white supremacists in 1898. Elaine, Arkansas, there was a massacre against the black sharecroppers there who were organizing for fair wages. Durham, North Carolina, just so many places, Bronzeville, Illinois, so many places where we try to get an economic footing, and it always, always, always gets sabotaged. And the problem is, it just always goes right back to systematic white supremacy. We can put all of these theories on paper, what would work, what would not work, what would be feasible. But for some reason, nobody can ever seem to do anything to thwart the white supremacists from organizing and destroying everything that we try to build economically. And then we get forced into a economically deprived underclass. And dealing with the white supremacists, that's always glanced over. We have to figure out how to deal with the white supremacists, and nobody's telling us who they are. Nobody's pointing them out, and nobody who's not a white supremacist, they don't seem to have the power to do anything to stop them to help us produce justice. So again, how do we deal with the problem of systematic white supremacy that's global?
Well, my view is that white supremacy it has a paper trail. It's rooted in a very specific financial system, a very specific, and I'm not just saying a system like in the abstract. I mean specific cartels of international banks that basically have the whole country in a chokehold through debt. And that's just my perspective. I could be wrong, but that's my perspective. But I'm open to alternative, theories about what it really is rooted in. Because my view is that it's rooted in something ultimately that's based in a specific and centuries old, global way in which the resources and wealth of not just this country, but many countries have been controlled by a small group,
Well, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, the late Dr. Welsing, who was a brilliant black psychiatrist who was in Washington, D.C., she gave a great theory about the root of white supremacy globally, because when she was in college, she went to Germany. She wanted to study the Holocaust. She wanted to study what happened and why. Why did they decide to eliminate so many people? And she realized that the problem wasn't religion, it wasn't social, it was a genetic ethnic cleansing. They didn't feel like the Jewish people were white enough. and this was about genetic survival. So her theory was white supremacy is rooted in white genetic survival, because if you are around people who are black and they are the global majority, when you procreate, that's going to create black or non-white offspring. So in order to maintain your survival as a global minority, you have to create a system that's brutal, and it deprives the non-white people of basic human rights. So that was her theory. The rule and the reason of white supremacy and the root of it was white genetic survival. And we hear a lot of people who believe in white supremacy talk about their birth rates, the numbers being dwindled down, white survival. And I don't think that's talked about openly enough, because that's really, according to Dr. Welsing, the root of a lot of the anti Black racism, because Black people have the capacity to basically annihilate the genes to a certain degree too, and I'm trying to put this in very sensitive terms. So black people have been the antithesis of whiteness. The culture of whiteness is basically we're not black, and everything has to be anti-black in order to have a culture of white supremacy. So that's what the root of it is, according to our sister Dr. Welsing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it my only skepticism though is because whenever I think of things in terms of biology, I have to think. I don't know what your view on that is. They say, our biology, has existed for thousands and thousands of years. Mostly for the most part. Most of the human genetics. You know, I'm actually skeptical of genetics. The a lot of the assumptions we have about genetics and biology and how that works, but we don't have to get into that.
Right.
But my skepticism would be that, for thousands and thousands of years, if we're defining white people as basically Europeans who are light skinned and light eyes, who were in Europe, living in Europe, they the white supremacy did not really arrive until a very specific point in history. Like,
That's
and
correct.
this
That's
is
correct.
thousands and thousands of years, and before then, when what recorded evidence we have of Europeans coming into contact with non-white people it wasn't a relationship of white supremacy, or it didn't exhibit the same tendencies. You more often than not had fusions. They would willingly mix together and form new peoples. Even, I mean, this is in large part how some ethnicities, like in Finland, were formed. There's a mix between white and, I don't know if they're the Sami Asian, something like that. So I tend not to want to look toward biological explanations. I mean, one, because it's the time issue. People have been around for thousands of years, and white supremacy was around much more recently. And two, I just I want to be more optimistic and believe it's not about biology. It's not about genetics. There's a way humanity can bring justice to the world. I mean, or there's a way for Americans to acquire justice. But that's just my perspective.
Well, yeah. Well, you're right. There were, white people have been around for thousands of years. The concept of white supremacy historically is relatively new. It came out of Spain first. Spain had the first blood quantum laws. They had something called, I think, limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. And they were the first to implement that in the 15th century. And the reason why they did that is because you had black people in Spain who were ruling for 700 years. You had the black Moors. And when they had the Reconquista, the Spanish realized, okay, these black people have changed the phenotype of Spain. They've darkened the people up and made somewhat of a fixed mulatto race. Spanish people originally used to be blonde hair, blue eyed, just like many other people in Europe. Even now, the Spanish people and Southern Italians and people down there where the Moors were are genetically darker than Northern Europeans. They try to blame the Mediterranean, but that's not it. They understood that it was that Moorish bloodline. So that was part of the Reconquista, to get those black Moors out of Spain. And when they did, the Europeans from Spain were able to get those Moorish maps, get access to those Moorish trade routes, and then start to travel out and venture outside of Europe and come in contact and encounter Black and dark Aboriginal people around the world. This is when they started to implement systematic white supremacy. So it was coming out of Spain first. And it appears to be based on them realizing that they, Europeans, are a global minority, and you're in a world full of these dark and brown people who could genetically wipe you out. So they had to implement a system where they control the people. And if you can control the people, you can control um, miscegenation, as they call it now. And that's why they had miscegenation laws here in the United States and other places, where they determined who could procreate and who could not procreate based on race. They would have the one drop rule based on race, saying if you have one drop of black blood, that makes you black. So all of these weird blood quantum laws started to come about in order to really suppress black people and dark skinned Aboriginal people. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and that's true. Um, all the blood quantum stuff. A lot of that was related to the development of race, so-called race science itself. But it's true that Spain was the blueprint for European. The Reconquista was the blueprint. It was the first thing for all European colonialism. That's true.
Oh,
I mean, that was
mhm,
the paradigm that set the model. But I have to wonder. Don't you think that's more rooted in religion? Because it's not just that they were Europeans and they were white. It was specifically that it was Western Europe and Western Christianity. Whereas, there's people with blue eyes and blonde hair, over in the East with the Slavs, Russians or whatever, and they had Eastern Christianity. And their contact with non-white people did not lead to, the same results. And I think there's a huge angle here that's religious that might be, worth taking into consideration, because the Reconquista wasn't, before it was about race, it was about religion, and the race stuff became an extension of the religious conflict, to my understanding, where it wasn't just that these were outsiders because they look different and they had different genetics. It was that they had a different faith, and that the descendants of people who had that faith I don't know if you heard of this, they had to hide it. They
mhm.
pretended that they were uh conversios or whatever they were called, and that their descendants were more likely to basically be maintaining that a faith, a different faith in secret. So I wonder what your perspective on that is.
Yeah, because a lot of people try to reduce it to just a religious thing, but that's not the case, because in Spain it was the so-called Christians against the Muslims, but it was really the whites against the blacks, because you had a lot of the Moors who actually converted to Christianity. They were called Moriscos, and they still marginalized them. They still expelled them. I think King Philip around 1609 expelled all the Moriscos, and these were Christians. Even now, black people converted to Christianity and they still got marginalized. We were marginalized during slavery. There's a black church and a white church. Even today, you're supposed to both be Christians, but we don't share the same religious facilities. So it's all based on race. Race trumps religion and all other things. Religion, communism, all the other isms. It's always trumped by racism, and racism in the form of white supremacy. So it all roads always lead back to white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, but what about elsewhere though? Because I know that in North Africa today, you do have people with lighter skin. Some people, it seems like it's a mix. In the Middle East, you have people with light eyes, you have people with dark eyes, and I don't see that there's if there's colorism, it seems like it was very recent because, for example, I know this is anecdotal, but speaking on experience, in terms of the nobility of a family's lineage in Middle Eastern societies, uh, the racial factor is totally like it's meaningless. Like there's absolutely no correlation. You know, people with very dark skin and very dark features oftentimes come from the highest and most esteemed noble families. And sometimes this is literally the case. Actually, I could name the village itself. People with lighter hair and lighter eyes are considered more of like the lower class, you know, based on the family name they come from, just tendencies, you know. And then in terms of marriage, it's not even a consideration in terms of, you know, what you look like, in terms of how white or how dark you are. It's only based on family name. So
Mhm.
what about that dynamic where it seems like, I mean, is it just something Europe? Is there something in Europe specifically, or is it the white pigmentation in general?
I think if the white skin, there has to be a dominating thing over dark skin, and it trumps religion. Like, let's go back to North Africa. You mentioned North Africa. In Morocco, you had some of the white Arabs, and in Islam, you're not supposed to conquer and dominate other Muslims, but those Moroccan Arabs went down into West Africa to another Muslim stronghold and conquered them. These were darker, black skinned Muslims, and they had no problem conquering them and slaughtering them and taking over their land and their resources. So this was very common with a lot of the pale skinned Muslims attacking other dark skinned Muslims. So that usually, the white skin or the pale skin usually trumps all of that stuff. And again, in theory, they have all of these theoretical edicts, but in practice, they practice something different. They practice a common law. And I think that's global. Even in Asia, some of the pale skinned Asian people, they still marginalize the dark skinned Aboriginal people over in these lands, and the Filipinos, and in those lands, the black skinned Negritos over there, because you got black people all over Asia. In the Philippines, black folks with afros, they get marginalized by the paler skinned people over there. So it's a global thing. It's a global thing. And that mindset has basically, you got a lot of people who come over here to the United States, and they want to get closer to the white supremacists here, because America is a very prosperous late nation, and we got a lot going on here. And a lot of people, when they get here, they bring some of the anti-black racism with them, and they don't mind being second fiddle to the white supremacists here as long as they can be on top of us. So that's another weird dynamic that we have too with other people who've been marginalized by white supremacy, because white supremacy has devastated many of their homelands. So instead of fighting white supremacy, they come over here and be perfectly fine with being second fiddle. And that helps to perpetuate white supremacy. So that's a problem as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely recognize that. You know, I see where you're coming from when it comes to the dynamic with immigrant groups. You know, that come here and basically don't have a lot of respect for the historical the groups that have been here, and you know try to basically take advantage of the race relations in a way that they feel can benefit them.
Right.
But you know, I don't know. I think that there's interesting cases of the lighter skin and the darker skin dynamic because what do you think the origin of it is? Because I think I don't really believe in that genetics are just, you know, what they say is what they tried to say before, but they're unable to say it anymore because it's been disproven that genes are basically fixed because of directly because of natural selection in the past, and that's the origin of all the physical differences. And it's just these fixed units of heredity where it seems like people are more dynamically able to adapt to different environments and this has physical consequences. And I think it's related to the sun when it comes to skin color, is it not? Or
Not really, not really, because you have there were Eskimos that were very dark skinned, or I don't Inuit people. I'm like, I think Eskimo was a pejorative term, but you had some of the people living in cold areas who had dark skin, and even in Europe, what we see as European pigmentation, the blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin. Many scientists say that that was some type of form of albinism because of the Wormian Ice Age. So there's different theories on that. But what we do know is that when people came out of Europe, according to Dr. Welsing, when they started to procreate with some of the Aboriginal people around the world and they saw the offspring, they realized that the offspring was going to be non white. So every mammal or every living being, they do want to preserve whatever bloodline or whatever species or whatever look that they have. So they realize if we keep procreating with these people just willy nilly, they're not going to look like us. So I think that was the root of white supremacy. In order to maintain or to create a within a global society, to maintain whiteness, you had to create a system of segregation where you're basically protecting your own genetics. In order to do that, you have to conquer the world and take over the people who could marginalize your bloodline. So I think that's the root of white supremacy. They had to go in and control the Aboriginal people, control the resources, control the wealth, control the finances, control their movement. So the white supremacists came already coming from a war society in Europe because there was a lot of wars in Europe. They utilized that war society on the Aboriginal people, and we're still dealing with that to this day. That's my theory.
yeah, I mean, again, I just the skepticism for me is just I think that we're dealing with very specific histories,
Hmm.
and human history itself, they say, is 10,000 years old, right? And then human
It's
beings,
much
they
longer,
say that,
right?
yeah, that's what they say. I may not be true, and
Yeah,
then
they found fossils over here, like of human beings going back 20,000 years, from what I understand. So yeah, there's
yeah. Well, I just mean like in the sense of recorded civilization, like
right,
agriculture and stuff. Yeah.
right,
And then human beings, like biologically, have been around for God knows how long, over 1 million years, and they say modern humans is 200,000. They keep changing it. I don't know. But, regardless, I think that I don't know if it's a binary where it's just different races are only defined by whether they have white skin or light eyes or dark eyes and dark skin. For example, in Africa itself, I'm sure you know this, there's different ethnic groups. They may have dark skin and dark eyes, but they're not the same people. They still identify as different peoples and they don't consider themselves the same, different ethnic groups and things. So as far as what makes a race in terms of what they want to preserve and so on and so on, I don't know if it's just about the appearance. I think that it's more about a specific historical lineage that's based on a shared story and a shared, historical, existence, and I think that's more important in terms of how people come to define themselves. And I think the notion of, white nationalism, let's say, or white supremacy, I think that's, there's a lot of things that have been brought around that same time as the rise of white supremacy. It's capitalism, it's colonialism, it's all these different ways in which humanity itself is under assault. And from every corner, from the family to spiritual, everything is under nature, everything is under assault. So I like to look at it more of not as a specific people just trying to preserve themselves, because what specific people, just what having a few physical characteristics. I tend to see it as a crisis humanity is facing, where it's been on a path of self destruction and self immolation, and I see communism as a way to turn back against that. But that's just my view.
Right. Well, but the thing is, it's the white supremacists. They're the ones who came up with all of the racial classifications, and they're the ones who enforce the racial classifications. Modern racial classifications only came about around 1775, I think, and that was Blumenbach, the Frederick Blumenbach, the German physicist, and he was the first one to say, okay, there's a Caucasian race, there's a Negroid race, there's a Mongolian race, there's a Malaysian race, and he was the one who said, okay, yeah, the Caucasian race, they're the best. They're the ones on top. They're the most beautiful and they got the most attractive skulls. So that started coming about with them. So they were already planting the seeds of more white supremacy with scientific so called justifications of it. And when they start putting these things into law, saying, okay, the whites can live here, but you blacks are going to have to live there, and we're going to militarily enforce this, that's when it becomes a problem. When you have the dominant white society making these distinctions and enforcing these distinctions militarily. So it just goes beyond opinions because it's easy to say, hey, we're all just human and we're all the same. But you have a group of people who believe in white supremacy who are dictating how people can live and survive based on this racial construct that's artificial, yet they've created it and they're backing it up militarily. And it affects the lives of the people who are victimized by these racial categories. So again, it always goes back to the white supremacists. They are the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that the categories were created as you described, and and yeah, that's how that was the justification they used to loot and genocide the world. But I just want to draw attention to that category, the Caucasian race or all these, that doesn't refer to like a real shared historical existence. It doesn't refer to anything specific. It refers to an existence purely defined by exclusion and negativity. But
Right.
in terms of the positive content, there's nothing there. It's a nothingness. It's just a not others. But in terms of the selfhood, there's no real positive selfhood to speak of that it's referring to. And I think that follows a pattern of, the rise, and that's the communist perspective basically, is that the white supremacy you're talking about is a form of nihilism. It's a worship of nothingness
Right.
that arrives on the scene of humanity and history at the same time as capitalism, which is related, which is another form of worshiping nothingness, of money for money's own sake. And money, is doesn't necessarily refer to anything specific. It's just profit for profit's sake, regardless of, you know, what the consequences are. So I see these things as related and part of the same, historical phenomena, more or less.
Now going back to the scientific racism, see, this is why reparations now for foundational Black Americans is very important. Because during slavery, they created these scientifically racist ideologies, and those racist ideologies still hunt us now. We still have books like The Bell Curve and other books like that. The Heritage Foundation, they put out studies with this same type of anti Black rhetoric that they try to base it in science based on the Blumenbach theories. And we're still suffering from the residuals of that now as foundational Black Americans. Even other things like the way our diet was maintained during slavery, during the 1700s, 1800s. We were forced to eat certain foods that lacked nutritional value and foods that actually harmed us. And some of these genetic deficiencies were passed down, the high blood pressure, hypertension, things like that. That was passed down genetically based on what we were forced to eat and being deprived of nutritional value during slavery. We're still suffering from those things. So this is why reparations is very important, because of those anti-Black things that were promulgated during slavery are still haunting us right now. So do you think that reparations would be a viable solution to help remedy some of the past atrocities that we're still suffering from?
My view is that it's fundamental. There's no way that this country moves forward as a unified nation. You know, black people were it was understood back then when the slavery was abolished that the former slaves would get 40 acres and a mule. Why?
Right.
Because even then they understood you could be free on paper, you know, but even then they understood if you're going to be a free American citizen, you need to have land, you need to have something to stand on. And, you know, that was never given to black Americans. And, you know, the stuff about being a permanent underclass you're talking about, it's definitely related to that legacy. So, you know, I fully support it. Um, and you know, and another thing, you know, I want to get your thoughts on this because it's interesting. Because isn't it also true that those racial categories, in large part, have also made it so that black Americans could not be, you know, insist upon their unique historical existence as foundational black Americans, right? And then basically getting lumped in with every other kind of black ethnic group
Mhm,
because of the classifications that you mentioned that were created, you know?
mhm. Yeah, that was an interesting dynamic when they would try to lump us in with different groups. And also another thing that's very interesting, that there were black people already here on this land. This was very well documented. And they first brought African enslaved people over here 1619. That's why they emphasize 1619 so much. That's the first time they actually had people from Africa coming to North America. But there were black people already here that was very well documented. There was the San Miguel del Guadape settlement that Moors came over with the Spanish and they rose up against the Spanish. And the Spanish went and they fled to the Caribbean, and the black people amalgamated in with the other Native American tribes. And there were so many other black Aboriginal tribes here that the Europeans saw when they got here, but they were all just reclassified as Negro. They just put everybody together and said, you guys are all Negro, and these are the rights you have, these are the rights you do not have. So they've always tried to play those little games with our ethnicity. And also, they've tried to other us away from this land by saying, okay, you guys are African American, and that kind of makes us guests on our own land. So a lot of people now are recognizing their Aboriginal status. And even as foundational Black Americans, there was no United States until foundational Black Americans built that. So technically, we are still indigenous to the United States because we didn't immigrate here. So there's a lot of very interesting dynamics as far as that.
No, that's real interesting. I didn't know about that. That dynamic, you know, before 1619.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read too much about, you know, the exact origins of America and the people's year, but that's very interesting, you know. But
Mhm.
you know, more or less, you know, I would say, you know, I think your perspective is very interesting, and you know, I definitely think you've got a lot of the history correct, you know, in terms of how things match up. You know, maybe we just may see things a little bit differently as far as the cause, you know, but you know, it's more like an agree to disagree kind of thing, I guess, because you know, it's a matter of, well, what strategy do you think is the most viable? Because I'm open minded too, you know, and
I think, man, if the United States did the right thing with reparations, that's going to be the first step. You do the first step with reparations, that will be a big step to making America what it's supposed to be, a land of equality, a land of equity, a land of justice. And also, reparations, that would be an economic stimulus for the entire economy, that will stimulate the economy, that will stimulate education, skill development, that will stimulate better health. We, as foundational Black Americans, we've always been the moral fiber of this country. We've always been very patriotic. The money we get will not be sent outside of the country, and we will do so many phenomenal things that will benefit the entire country. And it would just be a good look internationally. so that America won't look like hypocrites when they go and wag their finger to other nations telling them about democracy. And these countries look at America like, hey, we see what you're doing to those black people over there. So how are you going to wag your finger to us? So just on an international level, that would look good, and that would make this country the nation that it's supposed to be. So that would be the first step.
See, I agree with that, and obviously, if black people found a way to get the reparations by any means, however they see fit, I wouldn't. Far be it from me to want to stand in the way. But what I think about is strategy. Like, how does it happen? How does it made happen? And I
It's
think, yeah.
simple. Yeah, it's very simple. The same way they do with the red Native American tribes. Remember when they had when they started the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they had the Freedmen's Bureau at the same time. The Freedmen's Bureau, they had the Freedmen's Banks, and they saw how much money we were putting in those banks, and they let the Indian Bureau of Indian Affairs, they let that thrive, and they sabotaged the Freedmen's Bank. The white supremacists gutted that and took all the money from that, and then broke up the Freedmen's Bureau and never gave us the 40 acres and a mule and the economic wherewithal we needed after slavery. So that put us in a bind. So they could do reparations the exact same way they do with the Native American tribes. You designate who's qualified, which we've already worked out. We know how to find out who has foundational Black American ancestry and lineage, and then allocate the resources the same way, with checks, land grants, casinos, tax-free status. There's so many other ways they can do it, but the template is already there. Just do it the same way they do it with the red Native American tribes.
I mean, I believe they can do it. Like, they can do it if they wanted to do it.
Of
Absolutely.
course,
Like,
of course.
100%. It would. I mean, it would be. It would definitely be very possible. But when I say strategy, like how it would be done, I mean more in the sense of like a political strategy to force it to happen. Because clearly the powers that be don't want this to happen.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of political obstacles. And the obstacles, they're political obstacles. They're not like technical obstacles, like in the sense of, oh, this is impossible. It's obstacles in the sense of there's political forces that stand in the way of this. So when I think of a strategy to maneuver about that to actually get this done and make this happen, I can't help but come to the conclusion, and if you see it differently, I'm open to hearing your perspective. I can't see it. I can't imagine it happening unless it's something that's made popular and linked up with you know something that's also general. Not to say that it's like it's for everyone. It's still very specific to foundational Black Americans, but to where, for example, in addition, like you link it up, reparations, you link that up, for example, with debt cancellation, or you link it up with another land reform as well. That way, other groups have something to gain from it as well. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, but what happens is it ends up gutting us out of it. And they did that with affirmative action. Affirmative action was supposed to be for us. It was supposed to be corrective action because black people were excluded. They said, well, let's create an affirmative action program to let's give somewhat of a preferential treatment to black people so that they can get certain job positions, certain school admissions. But what they did at the last minute, instead of doing it for black people, they said, let's just do it for minorities. And minorities, that's a catch-all term. Everybody's a minority in a certain sense. White women are minorities. Native Americans are minorities. Gay white people are minorities. Hispanics are minorities. Handicapped people are minorities. So affirmative action ended up benefiting white people more than it benefited black people. And the interesting thing, they tried to pretend that there was this big flood of black people beating the system off of affirmative action, which we weren't. The dominant society, they're very well aware that affirmative action was something that benefited them more than us. So again, these catch-all programs like minority, diversity, that doesn't work for us because what happens is other people get to capitalize off of our suffering. That's why they create these terms that's almost like boogeyman terms that's supposed to be for black people, but they're really for other people to benefit from. Like DEI, that's the new boogeyman term. Diversity, equity, inclusion. That's more of the white LGBT people. They benefit off that, but they make it seem like it's a black boogeyman program where unqualified black people are siphoning off jobs and positions from qualified whites and Asians. Same thing with CRT. That's another boogeyman term that was cooked up in one of these white supremacist think tanks, where in schools, white kids are going to be punished by listening to Black history and all it. All of these are boogeyman terms that's created by the white supremacists. They create their own form of discrimination that they pretend Black people are practicing against them. So we got to be very specific about what we're supposed to get as foundational Black Americans. We need reparations for foundational Black Americans. When they gave reparations to the Japanese, they didn't attach anything else to it that would benefit the rest of dominant society. They just gave it to them. Even when they give money to victims or the survivors of the Holocaust, they don't attach it to anything else. They just give it to them. With the Native Americans, the red ones, when they give them their benefits, they don't attach it to anything else. With Black people, because anti Black racism is such a cultural phenomenon, just the thought of us getting something that nobody else is getting, that's damaging to the psyche of the white supremacists. So I think just getting that type of anti-black racism from being so normalized, that's something that needs to be worked on by people in the dominant society who do not believe in racism. We have to stop normalizing this vile anti-black racism that says we're not supposed to get anything unless everybody else can benefit from it, because that is by definition slavery. That's what we had to do. We had to work and we had to suffer and we had to sacrifice so everybody else could capitalize off of our labor and suffering. So people have this whole slave mindset with us. If we're not being the slaves for everybody, anything we do is not valid. So that has to be changed psychologically, collectively. So that's something that needs to be worked on, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from with affirmative action and even civil rights law. I mean, to be honest, it's not just white people, it's all these immigrant groups have totally capitalized on that. I mean, people, there's Brahmins, they come from the top caste in India. I don't know if you know how that works. And,
Oh,
they reap benefits from that shit, and there's
you do?
people come around the world who have historically suffered zero oppression anywhere, and they come here and they benefit from things that were originally designed for black people. So I totally see where you're coming from, and I can see the suspicion, and I can see the record historically that especially with civil rights. I mean, black people will gain something, and then it's made for everybody, and then they get the short end of the stick, more or less. So
Absolutely.
I see where you're coming from with that, and then I would think, just from my perspective, then if I would think that politically speaking, there would have to be an independent black voice, that has leadership over the black community and can negotiate and hold the votes and hold the support as leverage, you know, and that independence is needed so they don't get screwed over in any kind of alliance or anything like that. But the
That's the thing.
reason I
See,
yeah
let me break that down. See, we can't have that. Again, white supremacy. The COINTELPRO program by J. Edgar Hoover, that made sure that we could not have a so-called black messiah. That's something that needs to be studied. People really need to study the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which is still alive today. In 1970 or 71, there was a group called the Weather Underground. They broke into a field office, I think it was in Philadelphia, and they got this document from the FBI. And this was the COINTELPRO papers. And this was a very, very deep document showing how the FBI has systematically went around monitoring any type of black leader or potential black leader in black society all over. This was in the 1950s and 60s. And it specifically says there can never be a rise of a black messiah. Any type of black power movement has to be suppressed. Any type of black leadership, they have to be suppressed. We have to take control over them. And this is why so many black leaders have been assassinated, marginalized, or jailed. And that program is still valid to this very day. So I just say, hey, let's go directly to the dominant society. We don't need a black leader because the black leader is already going to be co-opted. When we have black spokespersons, usually they're co-opted by some type of political party, especially on the Democrat side. When we see certain politicians who happen to be black, they can only say so much, or their funding is going to get taken away, and they're going to get marginalized. So we just have to go directly to the dominant society and say, hey, look, this is what needs to be done. Um, because if we try to, have a so-called black leader or whatever, people try to put me into the black leadership category. I tell people all the time, not a black leader. We don't need a black leader. We just got to get on code and be on the same page and let logic be the leader. And um, let's get on a unified front and just say to the dominant society and the people that's holding and maldistributing the resources, hey, this is what we need. And we're not going to participate in some of the political parties that you guys put out here because that legitimizes the benign neglect program that you have against us, because that's another thing. They created a benign neglect policy in the late 1960s in order to make us invisible, and that benign neglect policy is still here. So we as black people collectively, not just with the leader, we need to say, hey, we're not going to participate in the electoral process. We will drop out of that process altogether and just do things among our own group if you do not give us the right resources we need in order to participate in that system. So there's different tactics that we can use, and we can be as innovative as possible because nothing has worked so far. But we can be innovative, and the dominant society, if they want to do the right thing, they can do the right thing. So it's a work in progress for all of us.
I mean, yeah, that's leverage, withholding votes, things like that. That's really interesting, and it's and I fully support it. And but another thing though is the a few things. The coins all pro 100%, but the Panthers specifically, not all Black Power groups, but the Panthers specifically, they repped communism. They were Marxist-Leninists, and the reason they did, and they put that with Black Power from their writings, is that the issue is the dominant society is divided on class lines, and yes, sometimes they come together, you know, racially, but that is a trick that the ruling class uses to basically trick and deceive the lower rungs or the working class to basically, turn their energy and turn their direction outward against black people and against other races.
Mhm.
So there's a class angle to it, I think, where when it comes to the dominant society, or the white America, basically, there's a class division there that I think is fundamental to this dynamic in terms of how to maneuver it.
And now you brought up the Panthers. That's a very good point you brought up, that they believed in communism, and the thing that got them, it wasn't the guns and the weapons they had. A lot of people believe that COINTELPRO program, the FBI brought down the Panthers because the Panthers were armed. No, they all they did was change the gun laws. They immediately changed the gun laws in California, so that was a nothing burger. The problem with the Panthers is that the Panthers were feeding people. When they had the free lunch program, which was a form of communism, they like, we're just going to feed the community. That was the problem, because when you can feed people, that's the first step of nation building. So what the FBI did, all they did was hire black people, gave them little stipends to go and infiltrate. They had a man named Dothard Perry, who was a very well-known FBI agent who became well-known later, who infiltrated the Panthers. You had William O'Neill, who they paid off to go help get Fred Hampton assassinated, who was a Black Panther leader, killed that poor man in his sleep. So white supremacy will still trump capitalism. Will trump communism. They just give somebody a couple of dollars to do the dirty work for them. So we're still circling back to white supremacy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but the way I see it, and the communist view has always been, it's that it always circles back to that because it's been the most effective thing to wage that class struggle. It's been the most effective thing to basically make sure that workers don't unite together against the ruling class, the people who own all the resources and wealth and banks and finances of the country, which, again, it's a small minority of people, and I'm not saying that, all the racial differences can be ignored and the ways that the white working classes have bought into that dynamic against black people can be ignored, and it definitely needs to be understood. But I think that broader picture, their ability to bribe people and undercut the communist strategy, like the breakfast program the Panthers used, when you target the fundamental sources of wealth in this country, ultimately what you're talking about is the power of labor, the power of people actually who, build the country, who, keep it running, like at the fundamentals level, at the level of fundamentals. And I can't speak for the whole country, but in Detroit, for example, you go into any factory, it's white and black. A whole lot of black people, a whole lot of white people, but they're both blue collar workers. They're both working the same type of jobs, and
But white people owning them factories, though, that's the thing.
yeah, you're right, absolutely, and
And
it's the race that's used so that the white person who owns the factory tells the white worker that, hey, we're the same, let's team up against the black guy. And that's the way the white worker is basically deceived and swindled into, in the long run, what does it lead to? It leads them to, dying on fentanyl and in poverty and debt, and it's
great
not
point.
even good for them.
Great point. And you know what? That started in the 1600s because you had white indentured servants and you had black indentured servants. And the racial dynamic was not there yet, but you had the rich white European planter class. There was a big rebellion. There was something called Bacon's Rebellion, where you had white workers and black workers rising up against the white elitist. After they suppressed that rebellion, they said, hey, we got to do something. We got to stop this from happening. We can't have these folks joining forces against us. So they went to the white indentured servants and said, hey, we're all European. We're the same. So I can give you guys a couple of better privileges than those black guys over there. And that helped to squash any future rebellions. The poor whites got a couple of more um, little ducats of money and a couple of more privileges. Like, hey, we're going to give that guy, the black guy, we're going to make him indentured for life, and you're just going to be indentured for 7 years. And that was good enough for some of the white guys, and they went along with the program. Even now, the white elitists will tell the poor white guys, "Hey, look, those black guys, we're going to mass incarcerate them. We'll let you do your fentanyl, and we won't arrest you." And that's good enough for some of the poor whites. So you have a lot of poor white people who maintain white supremacy more than anybody. And that's been an issue. And let's go back to the 16, 1700s. You know what's interesting? Some of the people who were fighting against the white elitists or the European elitists were the pirates, the people that we now know as the pirates, the golden age of piracy. And I've been doing a lot of research on this. The pirates have been portrayed as the bad guys, which many of them weren't. Many of them saw the finesse for what it was. They saw the land owning elitists as evil and exploitive. So they were battling against them. Many of those pirate ships were actually slave ships. The pirates were stealing those slave ships. Queen Anne's Revenge, those were slave ships at first. And they knew how evil the land owning elitists were. So they were waging war against them because they knew they were exploiting European labor as well. But historically, they've made the pirates the bad guys, and they lynched a lot of those European pirates as well. And also, those pirates would liberate a lot of black people. Many of the people on those pirate ships themselves were black, about 30% of them. Many of the pirate leaders were black too. Lauren DeGraff, he was a black guy. They don't portray him as that now, but they had somewhat of a level of equality on those pirate ships to a certain degree because they understood that they had to fight the rich elitists. So there's always been this dynamic where the wealthy elite knew how to play the racial um, divide and conquer game, and unfortunately, too many poor whites have gone along with that program today.
Yeah, and I see where you're coming from because the onus is not on black people to have to basically risk everything to make sure that the white working class gets his shit together and stops selling out to the white capitalist class. That's a problem they got to sort out themselves.
Right. Right.
Um, and that's what I believe. I'm not saying exclusively white workers, but it's generalities.
Mm,
And one of the things, when I talk about communism and stuff, I'm talking about political organization. That's, it's mainly going to reflect the majority and the dominant society. And the onus is not on black people to have to make that happen and carry that out, although it don't exclude anyone.
mhm.
But, I think if there was that kind of movement that was able to emerge that could put aside the white supremacy, do you think there would be a possibility for a unity with black people?
I think so. I think there would be again, but a lot of working class and poor whites they've been finessed by the white supremacists in the media and a lot of the white elitists who want to use them as buffer classes. So they're fleecing your pockets. They're overtaxing you. They're keeping you out of jobs too because they get that cheap labor overseas. They're the ones keeping you out of the job market, but they'll point to black people like, hey, don't look at me, look at that black person who wants to rape your daughter, is that type of thing. And white people keep going for that finesse. So that's something that the dominant white society, they have to stop being finessed by the wealthy white elitist, making them think that the black boogeyman is going to get them, because that's not the problem. In fact, black people, we've saved white people several times over here um, during some of these wars and many other instances. So even going back into Europe, we can go real deep about the Moors saving people in Europe during the plague. So the problem that they have in the dominant society, the poor whites and working class whites, is the rich elitist white people exploiting you and telling you that we're the problem, which we've never been the problem.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. I don't think there's any way for the white working class people in America to gain their dignity back and gain their manhood back unless they put aside their hostility and their antagonization of black people. That's the number one source, of one of the main sources at least, of them being in the predicament that they're in. They've allowed themselves to be conned and duped into thinking that their black neighbor, who actually is their fellow American in history and in practice, and fought alongside them in wars. Like you said, you had ancestors in Germany, and we mentioned the Civil War before.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. The onus is not on black people to have them see the light in that regard. But I choose to be an optimistic person. I personally am a communist. I want to see this movement be built. I want to see a political alternative in this country that I think can bring people together. And I don't know. I think that it's not that I want everybody to risk everything for the optimism. It's more like I believe that there's got to be a justice that comes out of everything. The
Absolutely.
otherwise it's the law of the jungle, and it's every man for himself, more or less.
My man. All right, let me get up out of here, Has, man.
For
Good
sure,
conversation.
for sure. Great conversation, man.
Yes, indeed. Everybody, man, I got a book, man. My latest book, Foundational Black American Race Beta. You can get that on Amazon. Get that on Amazon now. Foundational Black American Race Beta. Very deep book. Talks about my life and my experiences and learning about racism and some of my thoughts and theories. It's a very good read. So you guys can check that out. All right.
All right, Tariq, thank you so much. Very interesting information you shared. I learned a lot of things, and I hope everyone had a good time. I got to bounce as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, see
All
y'all
right.
later. Good night.
Peace.